PowerPoint up there for me, or yes or no? If you don't, that's fine. I've gotten used to not using one, but if you got it, that'd be awesome. It's lesson 5 if you... There they are. Exodus 15. Sorry, I hadn't said that yet, had I? Exodus 15. I'm glad you are back. Not that I didn't enjoy spending my couple hours with Pastor Robert. I actually told Haley yesterday on the way home that Pastor Rob and I had usually... I'd seen Haley and the girls and Mom and Dad and Chad, and Pastor Rob was kind of some of the only other outside contact that I had, and I felt like I was also some of the only other outside contact that we had that he had. So you just sit down here for 35 or 40 minutes kind of just talking to each other. And I mentioned to Haley yesterday, I said, I'm glad we're getting back, or the other day, I'm glad we're getting back, but I'm kind of miss just kind of hanging out with Pastor Rob for a couple hours on a Sunday. Kind of look forward to it. But I'm glad you're back. And that you're back here with us. It'll make things much easier, because usually I have lots of questions, and sometimes I ask Pastor Rob and I get a head nod and a no nod back there from the back, but it's easier to ask you all some of the questions. Your faces haven't gotten any prettier, but that's okay. I'm glad to see them here. I'm glad to see you here. Exodus chapter 15. If you had been following along with me on Facebook, I'm glad that you had. If you hadn't been able to, it's perfectly fine too. You have missed some interesting stuff though, right? Through the first couple of chapters here in the book of Exodus, we've seen the plagues happen, and then most recently the crossing of the Red Sea. And I mentioned last week that, of course, we saw everybody who was that was an Egyptian soldier or armor or horse or chariot or whatever that was in the Red Sea, all of them completely wiped out. Okay, there of course probably would have been a few soldiers who had not made it into the Red Sea yet. Okay, and then that was one of the ways the tale got spread back through Egypt. Of course, the Israelites, this was a huge moment for them, becomes a reference point for them pretty much throughout the rest of their history, even to the present day, is the moment that God did this for them. When we get to chapter 15, and they're standing there on the banks of the Red Sea, and this miraculous event has taken place. There's been earthquakes and thunder and lightning, and the water's parted and not parted, and there's been fish swimming around. The kids have seen this crazy stuff. These people have been involved with this just absolutely absurd event, right? This would have been something that you would have definitely remembered, and it would have been vivid memories, probably to the day you die. We get to chapter 15, and as I mentioned a little bit last week, Israel here, throughout this chapter, throughout these couple of chapters, have been learning that God is their leader. Pillar of fire, the cloud, big huge cartoon arrow pointing to go towards the Red Sea. And now we see, as they're learning more about God being their leader, we get to chapter 15, and Israel has some more truths that they're going to learn about God. And as we go through the first 12 verses here, we're going to see that, first of all, the two major things here that Moses kind of writes about in this song that we're seeing here is, first of all, God is strong and He's unmatched. Now, we got to think of the past 40 days in the lives of the Israelites, right? With the plagues, the Red Sea, the stuff that's been leading them around, there's been some pretty amazing things have taken place. So when you were probably to ask the Israelites or even Moses, describe God right now in comparison to the Egyptian gods who you've been kind of under now for these several hundred years. Describe God, and Moses comes up with He's strong and He's under. There's nothing like Him. He took this river and changed it red. Brought the frogs in, brought the locusts in, they killed the free. All these amazing things, and all of these great gods that the Egyptians claim that they have, and these big temples we've built for them, and these pyramids, and all these rituals and things that they did, and they were so dedicated to. There's nothing compared when God wanted to speak and something wanted to happen. So as we see through the first 12 verses here of chapter 15, this is a song. Chapter 15 is this song. Kind of one of the, it's written in the context and the way that some of the Psalms are written. And a lot of some of the commentaries and things that I was looking at this week kind of consider this maybe the first psalm, was Moses kind of writing this. This was a way for Moses and the children of Israel to kind of look back at what God had just done for Israel. Now, we've got the sections here in verse 12, the section of the song. We see two full parts here. They call them strophes. And then we see a part of another one. The first strophe is the first 5 verses, as we'll see, begins with a confession about God. And then we kind of continue to move through it. Okay, so let's read the first 5 verses here of chapter 15. See the first part of Moses' song, looking back at what God had just done for Israel and describing that he is strong and unmatched. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he is become my salvation. He is my God, and I will prepare him, and a habitation my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom as of a stone. So the first part of Moses' song here, the children of Israel that they're singing, again looks back at what God had just accomplished for Israel. The Israelites understand now, right? We see them post-Exodus of Egypt following God. We see them quickly, though, pre-splitting of the Red Sea, turning kind of back towards the idea of why in the world did God bring us here? We would have been better off being slaves in Egypt than being slaughtered out here like wild animals by the Egyptians' armies. And then we see them post-splitting of the Red Sea, them now fully focused on God as being their protector and understanding that God's role as their strength and as their protection. Right? They had also then began to realize that God had been fulfilling this role forever, right? This wasn't just something that God just started to do with the Exodus of Egypt. He had been taking care of them as their protector, as their strength, since the time of their fathers. And we see that in verse 2 there. We see this reference to the patriarchs, right? The Lord is my strength and song. He has become my salvation. He is my God. I will prepare him an habitation. My father's God, right? So we see that reference there because they're realizing just exactly what God has been doing for them now for the duration of them being essentially Israelites. Now, there's an interesting thing there in verse 2. If you read it at the very first part of that, the Lord is my strength and song. So there is quite a bit of debate that is not the word song there shouldn't be in because it's kind of a weird thing to say when talking in the context here that Moses is writing about God being strength and protector and being a man of war, and you throw in there that he is just a song. Song's more of the language used would be more kind of a softer language than strength and man of war and power that we see. And I did some digging on it this week, and the reason Moses used the word song there is if you look at the translation of song back into the Hebrew, the word song here is the translation for shout. Okay, so this wasn't necessarily just like a hymn that we have. This would have been something they would have been like echoing through the beach there because they wanted to kind of not mimic but show the power of God. So the strength in the song, this would have been a song as in a war cry, right? This is what that means there, which I thought was kind of interesting to see. But we see the Israelites here recognizing the importance of the strength of God and the protection. Now, what were some of the implications here of each Israelite recognizing God as his own personal God? What becomes important about not just the nation of Israel accepting God as Yahweh, but actually each individual Israelite accepting him as Yahweh? What is that kind of implications does that show? If we know God as being Yahweh and being our strength and being our protector personally, then it's my personal responsibility to be faithful to him too, correct? It's not just us as a nation to be, as long as we are collectively following God. No, it becomes personal responsibility for each individual Israelite to make sure that he is worshiping and obeying what God has to say. Verse 3, the people picked up again here on the importance of the name Yahweh in their song. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. God now has emphasized his name to the Israelites with his interactions with them and the Egyptians as well. If we go back over to chapter 7, if you will, and look at verse 5. Good to hear pages again, Pastor Rob. We see, and the Egyptians shall know that I am what? The Lord, right? When I stretch forth mine hand upon Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. So the Egyptians shall know I am Yahweh. Go to verse 17, the same chapter. Thus saith the Lord, in this shalt thou know that what? Yahweh, I am the Lord. Again, go over to chapter 8 and look at verse 22. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know what? Again, here Yahweh, that I am the Lord. So we get to verse 3, and we see the people now coming to a complete recognizing the fact that the Lord is a man of war, and that he is in fact Yahweh. The Lord is his name. So as a result of that, as a result of God's actions, they believed and now understood that he would be near them, with them, and not just the presence of them, but be actively active in their lives. All right, an active part on a day-to-day basis. While they're in Egyptians as slaves, they know God's there, but he's just kind of there, and not really an active force to them, they think. But then we see them now recognizing God as being an active force in their lives. The first part of this song ends in verses 4 and 5 by just kind of another summation here of what God did to the Egyptian army. As Yahweh, of course, God drowned Pharaoh's army, making the soldiers sink to the bottom of the stone. Pharaoh's chariots and his host has he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom as a stone. So that's the first part of the song, still mentioning that God is strong and unmatched. The second part begins in verse 6, and it reads down through verse 10, and this continues here on the reflection of what God has done for Israel. Okay, so this is just a song that's been putting into text that they're seeing, but it's also a reminder for future generations exactly what God did for the Israelites during this time frame of their history. All right, so verse 6 down through verse 10. The right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. And in the greatness of thine excellency thou hast overthrown them that rose up against thee. Thou sentest forth thy wrath, which consumed them as stubble. And with the blast of thy nostrils the waters were gathered together, the floods stood upright as a heap, and the depth were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My lust shall be satisfied upon them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. Thou didst blow with thy wind, the sea covered them. They sank as lead in the mighty waters. Second part here again, we see continued reflection, but it becomes the right hand of God here becomes the central focus through these 4 or 5 verses. God's right hand, of course, we know is used several times throughout Scripture, and it's a poetic way of referring to God's omnipotence, right? It's a poetic way of showing his power and referring to his omnipotence. God can do whatever he pleases, right? And he can do whatever he pleases with his right hand. If he wants to part the Red Sea so the Israelites can walk across and kill the Egyptians while closing it up, he can. If he wants to cast his right hand and turn the water to blood, or send the flies, or send whatever he wants to do, as you've been seeing through the book of Revelation, he reveals the judgments when God casts it. When he wants to do that, he can do exactly whatever he wants to do. And there's not a thing in the world we can do but stop it, right? Again, showing his power and showing that he is completely and entirely unmatched. The Israelites had a front row view to this, right? Had seen this now on multiple occasions, and had observed these actions of his right hand. So that shows to them that his right hand became glorious in power, as you see there in verse 6, Okay, so again, just another way for them to describe his strength and the fact that he is completely unmatched. Now, God's right hand becoming glorious in power becomes illustrative of what God is capable of doing. Right, in verse 6, he's capable of taking that enemy and doing what? What's it say at the end of verse 6? He can take the enemy and do what to it? Dash them into pieces, right? Not just get rid of them, but make them tiny little insignificant pieces. That's what God's right hand is able to do. The crushing weight of the water returning to its normal depth was probably strong enough to tear the limbs from the Egyptian soldiers' bodies. And as the water came rushing in, they probably saw these Egyptians explode before their eyes, before it completely encompassed, the water completely went over. When it first hit, that's probably what they witnessed. That's why we see this here in verse 6. They have seen these Egyptians just explode from the water coming together. And that was, again, showing God's power and his might. What other reason would they have described this in this way? Right? Through the plagues, we don't see any of the Egyptians being dashed into pieces, right? We don't. We see them dying and things happening. But this would have been something that they probably would have witnessed, and again, something that would have left an impression, right? So we see them putting that into song here. When the soldiers rose up against the Lord, God tore them down in the greatness of his majesty and consumed them by his wrath. We see that in verse 7. The greatness of the excellency has overthrown them that rose up against thee. We see them pressing down others as they're kind of trapped, and then God parts the Red Sea and takes care of them. So this is just more ways for them to put into words a way to describe exactly what has happened. Suppose now, two people are fighting. One can use his hands while fighting, while the other one is just simply limited to breathing air through his nose as his offensive attack. What do you think is going to happen there? Right, the guy that can use his hands obviously going to pummel the guy who's always trying to blow on him with his nose. Moses helped convey the ridiculousness of the Egyptians' army claims. Egyptians had said the soldiers would destroy Israel with their hands, but God defeated them so easily that it was as if he simply just exhaled, and that took care of the fight. God's breath is a reference to the mighty wind that divided the Red Sea and caused it to return to normal. If you go to verse 21 of chapter 14, we see that reference as well. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea to be dry land, and the waters were divided. So this was a way God may or may not have blown on the water to make it depart. He could have, and whatever he wants to do, he could have just thought about it and it happened. But this was a way for them to describe it, right? There obviously was a wind, something happened, they felt a rush of wind while these waters were departing. This was a way for them to describe it. And the breath of his nostrils being that mighty wind that divided the Red Sea. Now, based on God's defeat of the Egyptians' army with just his breath, that leads us into the third part of this song in verse 11 down through verse 16, which starts off the third part, and it starts off with a rhetorical question. Okay, so let's go to verse 11 down through verse 16. Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee in glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? Thou stretched out thy right hand, the earth swallowed them. Thou in thy mercy hast led forth the people, which thou hast redeemed. Thou hast guided them in thy strength into thy holy habitation. The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold of the inhabitants of Palestina. Then the dukes of Edom shall be amazed, the mighty men of Moab trembling, shall take hold upon them, all the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. Fear and dread shall fall upon them by the greatness of thine arm. They shall be as still as a stone till thy people pass over. O Lord, till the people pass over, which thou hast purchased. So the third part starts off with this rhetorical question. Who is like unto you, or unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? And of course, the understood answer here is what? Nobody, right? No one is like it. Why is it so important then? When we've seen this a couple times now. Why is it so important for Israel to know there's nobody like God? Why is that so important for them? Why is he, continuing to kind of bring the point to the Israelites people that there is nothing like him?
They've been exposed to false gods and probably tempted to go with the world and stray.
Absolutely right. They have been for a long time now they had been tempted to follow after other gods. And God knew that as they moved into the promised land and moved into this new place, they were going to be tempted of these other gods as well, these worldly things. And of course, we know once they kind of get in that direction, we see the Israelites do what? Time and time again. Go right back to those false gods or whatever it is, something opposite of what God is doing here. So he's trying to describe to them and display to them the importance of knowing that there is literally nothing like Yahweh. Again, especially here when the Israelites get ready to enter into the promised land. Verse 11, God's holiness that we see is what makes him different from all the other gods. Right? Who is like unto the Lord among the gods? Who is like the glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? God's holiness, who he is, what he's able to do, is what sets him apart. Okay? And that's why we see that there in verse 11. As being holy, he's always going to do what is right. So Israel, therefore, can always trust him, right? If you know that the decisions being made for you are always the right decisions, then you can just put total faith in those decisions. So God's holiness allows the Israelites to always trust him. They didn't have to worry that one day God's just going to grow wild hair and turn evil, right, and start doing all the bad stuff to it. They didn't have to worry about that. What should have never even crossed their mind, because he's holy and that's what he is, what he does. Other nations had gods, especially during this time, that were requiring children sacrifice, slavery, certain ritualistic worships, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And they were constantly trying to do what? These sacrifices and these rituals were constantly trying to do what to these false gods? Just to appease them, right? Maybe if we do this right, this God will send the rain and the crops will grow. Or maybe if we do these certain amount of things, then all of our wives will be able to bear children. So on and so forth kind of goes these things. And there would have been, and there is, constant anxiety, right? Constant anxiety on, did I do enough to make sure that the gods are going to be pleased with me and then grant my wish and grant my request? You look through Roman times and Greek times and then read all of the stuff from the gods and stuff from Mount Olympus and all those different things. There is a constant begging and pleading to these gods, the god of war and all this stuff, to make sure that the gods are on their sides, and when things didn't go their way, because we didn't do enough to appease the gods. If you live like that, we can see the constant anxiety. Oh man, I hope I did enough. I hope we did enough to appease this God, or I hope we did enough to make sure things work out in our favor. God takes that completely away because he's holy and he knows always do the right thing. Okay? So we see that in verse 11. Verse 12, we also see another reference here to God's hand, right? Thou stretched out thy right hand, and the earth swallowed them. So we see, that's 3 or 4 different times now, just in these first 13 verses, this event has been referenced. You can imagine what this did to these people. And kind of the pure shock, and then the pure realization of what God had done for them. We see them continuing to mention it. God extended his right hand, and of course it swallowed up the Egyptians. The rest of the third strophe here looks forward to God's future dealings with the Israelites. Okay? So we see that, first of all, he's strong and unmatched. And if we jump into verse 13 of this, we see he was able to fulfill his promises. Okay? Israel, again, standing on the east side of the Red Sea, their ties with Egypt now completely severed. There's no easy path back. God wanted that sea there as a barrier between them and Egypt to help them think about the future in the promised land instead of their history in Egypt. So verse 13, the third strophe continues here by declaring that God would successfully lead the Israelites. So verse 13, Thou in thy mercy hast led forth the people, which thou hast redeemed. Thou hast guided them in thy strength of thy holy habitation. The promised land here, of course, is the references what we're talking about when it says the holy habitation. That's what they call it here. The crossing of the Red Sea made Israel confident in the fact that the Lord is going to guide them. He's redeemed. They are redeemed by His mercy and His strength, and then this confidence in the Lord leads them to an emboldening of these Israelites on the path that is ahead of them of conquering this promised land, this holy habitation. Now, instead of cowering against some of the enemies that they know they're getting ready to face, we kind of move through verse 14, right? The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold onto the inhabitants of Palestine, and then go to verse 15. Then the dukes of Edom shall be amazed, the mighty men of Moab trembling, and they shall take hold upon them. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. So because God is leading them, they have no need to be worried about the enemies that are going to be standing in front of them. Instead of cowering at the idea of facing the Philistines there in Palestine, or whatever, Palestine, however you want to say it, they said that the Philistines would be the ones that were anguishing the fact that the Israelites were coming. The same ideas would come for the chiefs here of Edoms, the dukes, the Edom, the mighty men of Moab as well, and all of the inhabitants of Canaan are going to be dismayed and worried that they are showing up to take away their land. If you see the end of verse 15, it says that all of the inhabitants of Canaan shall do what? Melt away. Okay? Melt away. Going to be helpless in facing the Lord. Now, that brings us to this. Sorry, too far. All right, so the comparison here of Israel's enemies to a stone marks the end of the third strophe here. Okay? Where are we at? Verse 16, Fear and dread shall fall upon them by the greatness of thine army. They shall be as still as what? As a stone. And that marks the end of this little song. This not little song, but this song here that the Israelites and Moses are writing down or singing here on the eastern banks of the Red Sea. Now, the first two parts of this song end also with a mentioning of rock or lead. Let's go back to verse 10. They sank as what? What does it say? Lead. If you go to verse 5, it says that the depths have covered them, they sank to the bottom as a what? So each time one of the parts of this is ended, it is ended with stone or lead in that way. Okay? With the mentioning of a rock. Now, the fourth part of this continues Israel's prospect of crossing over the promised land as God's redeemed. And that begins in the second part of verse 16. Verse 16 and verse 17 both mention more about them taking and entering into the promised land, and their hope for entering and taking the promised land is resting fully on the Lord here. All right? So the second part of verse 16. So as a stone, second part, till thy people pass over, O Lord, to the people pass over which thou hast purchased, thou shalt bring them in and plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell. To dwell in the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established. So the fourth strophe, the fourth part continues this prospect of them taking over as God's redeemed. Israel's hope for entering and taking the promised land again rests fully in the Lord. As you see there in verse 17, it lists all that the Lord would do to make possession of the land possible. Thou shalt bring them in, verse 17, plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell in thy sanctuary, which thy hands have established. This is what God has done or is going to do so they can take the promised land. The anticipation here of God's leadership in bringing Israel into the land is we can see this excitement building, right? God's been promising this since Abraham, and now they're going to be a part of them right now. They're going to be a part of them taking into the promised land as we see. So we can see the anticipation and the excitement kind of building for this. If you go over to Psalms 44 with me, we kind of see another perspective on the Israelites here being able to take this land, long after, or we see the perspective of the Israelites in the land, long after it had been conquered. Psalms 44. We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us what work thou didst in their days and in the times of old. How thou didst drive out the heathens with thy hand, and plantest them, which thou did afflict the people and cast them out. For they got not the land in possession by their own sword, neither did their own arm save them, but thy right hand and thine arm, and the light of thy countenance, because thou hast a favor unto them. Thou art my king, O God, command the deliverances for Jacob. Through thee will we push down our enemies, through thy name will we tread them under that rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, and hast put them to shame that hated us. In God we boast all the day long, and praise thy name forever. Selah. So we can see the anticipation in Exodus 15, verse 17, and then we can see the perspective that they have long after the land has been conquered. It affirms the hope there that they have in verse 17 of Exodus chapter 15. Okay, let's go down. Stay with me in Psalms, and let's read. Do we finish with verse 8? Yeah, finish with verse 8. All right, so as we see now in Psalms 44, the excitement and this affirmation of what God is going to do for them while taking over the promised land. What message about the conquest of the promised land did the forefathers kind of pass down to the future generations? We see there in those 8 verses of Psalms 44 that we just read, what did they... Pardon?
God's ability.
Exactly. Right? We see a couple times mentioned, it's not my bow, it's not my sword, it's not my strength, it's God. It's God that did this. They told how the Lord's hand had brought them into the land and had given them victory. The promised land here was not only for Israel, right, but it was also the place that God would choose to dwell with men. First, he does so in the tabernacle, then in the temple. Eventually, Christ will reign on the earth during the millennial reign. It's over in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4. And finally, Christ will reign forever in the presence of all the redeemed on a new earth. Revelation 21, 22 through 27. Truly the Lord shall reign forever and ever. If you go back to Exodus 15 with me, please. We'll finish up with this. If you go to verse 18 down through verse 21. So verse 17 talks about how the Lord is going to do it. Verse 18 says what? The Lord shall reign forever and ever. For the horse of Pharaoh went in with his chariots and with his horsemen into the sea, and the Lord brought again the waters of the sea upon them. The children of Israel went to dry land in the midst of the sea. And Miriam the prophetess and the sister of Aaron took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. And Miriam answered them, Sing ye to the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. So the promised land wasn't just for the Israelites, it's for a place for God to choose to dwell with men as well. And we see the Israelites referencing that God is going to reign forever. Now both the interlude of the narrative here in verse verse 19. In Miriam's song, we see in verse 20 and 21. Again, one more time, just recap what the Lord did for Israel. The focus here is on God's work. Miriam's song was sung by the women in response, meaning they would have sang the song at the end of each little part. So they'd have been through the first part, Miriam and the women would have sang their part of the song we see in verse 21, then the men would have sang the second part, so we see him kind of going back and forth here. Now that's kind of why that kind of, again, and that's there, those couple verses are there to show that the entire nation of Israel here, right? The entire nation is singing and showing the strength and power that God has displayed. This is where Israelites are at right now. And we're going to see them kind of move through some of these places as we continue to see their, of course, wandering around in the wilderness. This is kind of the map that we're at as we move through the next couple of chapters here in the book of Exodus. So, lesson number 5 now, finally finished up after about 4 weeks. I am the leader. We've seen God move them into the wilderness where He wanted them at, using a cloud of smoke and a cloud of fire as well. Or I guess a cloud of smoke would be a good way to describe it. And then Him being in charge, and the Israelites finally coming to a complete and total following of what God wants for them and leading them. Now we see, starting in chapter 15, a little bit down through chapter 17, we see God's, the sixth part of this is God's revealing Himself as being the provider. God's going to supply Israel's needs as they're on the journey here. Freed nation, and He's going to supply their needs, and the lesson's not maybe so much about God providing for them, we're going to see that, but maybe more so about the hearts of the Israelites as God is providing for them. Okay? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank You for the lesson that we had today. Thank You for being able to see the praising and the thanking of Moses and the Israelites for what You just done for them, and how this kind of became a big deal for each and every one of them, for the nation of Israel from there going forward. But making sure they took the time to recognize, first of all, your strength, the fact that you are unmatched, but secondly, how they now had freedom to allow You to be in total control. Now, that should have been from the beginning, and we know that. Took them some time, took them some miraculous events. Changes, but at this point in history, where they're at right now, they're all in. And great blessings can come from that as well, Lord. And the same thing for us. The same God that was able to do these things is the same God that we're serving now. The same ability, the same powers, and which means that we have the same requirements to be fully faithful in Your plan for us, knowing that You're in control of it, Lord. There's freedom in that. I pray we take hold of that. I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next little bit, that You use him in a mighty way. Lord, keep us attentive to the words You'd have for us from him this morning as well. In Your name I pray. Amen.